Well, I'm very excited to tell you all that for the next session, we have a live American audience joining us from Washington, D.C. So I'd like to welcome to the live broadcast, Washington, D.C., hello, and our Washington, D.C. MC, Colleen Grace. I think they'll be joining us on the screens in a moment. They're there. Great, welcome, Colleen. Colleen, would you like to say a few words, a little hello from Washington, D.C.? Oh, we've got a little lag on the line, so we'll just carry on. But you can see them. They're there. Washington, D.C. has joined us. Hello to Colleen and our audience in D.C. It's wonderful to have Washington, D.C. joining us, and of course, all our participants who are now joining us from other time zones as well. I'm delighted to say that our next session is with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. We are going to ask the Secretary General some questions here in Brussels, and then we'll hand over to Colleen in Washington, D.C. for some additional questions. And you get the chance to ask questions of the Secretary General. Just use the app if you've got the app. The Q&A function is where you can submit your questions online, or if you're here in person, raise your hand and I will call on you. Okay, let's give a round of applause to welcome NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to the stage. Welcome. Come on. Right there. Brilliant. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Secretary General.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back. I was here a year ago, and it's good to be back again.
Brilliant. My first question is about what it's like to be NATO Secretary General. You've actually been Secretary General for nearly a decade. You have to work with a lot of different countries and leaders. And I'm wondering, has that tenure given you any particular insight into how to keep NATO united and successful? What is your secret?
I don't know whether I have any secrets, but I think it's very much about keeping people together and different people together, because as you all know, we are 31 nations which are members of NATO, and soon we will be 32 with also Sweden, from both sides of the Atlantic, with different history, different culture, different political parties in power. And of course, that makes us all quite different. But at the same time, we have been able to be together as a big family, and I feel that my main purpose is to keep this big family happy and together. And we are able to be together despite our differences, because we all understand that in a more dangerous world, we are safer when we are together, North America and Europe. So my perhaps not secret, but my main message is that stay together. Unity is our biggest strength. And I used to be Prime Minister in Norway for 10 years, and most of that time I was Prime Minister in a coalition government with different parties, and to keep a government together, it's very much the same as to keep NATO together.
Could you tell us about some of the most formative experiences in your career? You mentioned a couple highlights just now, but how did you become Secretary General of NATO? What did that path look like?
Well, also, I was surprised when I was asked to become Secretary General of NATO, because I have never planned for being that. Actually, I made one decision, one clear, conscious decision about my career, and that was to not become a politician, but to start to work as a researcher in the Central Bureau of Statistics in Norway in 1989, because then I have finished my master degrees in economics in Norway, and I started on a PhD on something called econometrics, which is statistics and mathematics, and I was so fascinated by that. So my plan was to become a kind of professor, an academic, working on these very, very theoretical stuff. And then I was asked suddenly to become the Deputy Minister for Environment, And I promised myself and my wife only to do that for a year or two, and then to go back to the real important things, which is this research. But then that happened in 1990, and since then I've been in politics. And now I'm 64 years old, so suddenly I'm here. But then I was active in domestic Norwegian politics, and my main focus was on budgets and health and education and pensions and these big domestic issues. And then and then also becomes
one thing leads to another.
But I think that my formative years has been very much about actually growing up in a very political family, because I have to admit that both my mother and my father, they were very, as I say, active. I grew up in a flat, or where at the kitchen table my parents had many guests from all over the world. This was in the time of the apartheid, so we had freedom fighters from South Africa, and we had politicians and trade unionists from all over the world, and they partly lived in our flat and at least had breakfast in our flat, and I listened carefully to all those conversations, and that made me interested in politics. So actually, to try to answer your question, I think my most formative thing is, of course, that I decided to go into politics, and I stayed in politics for many years.
Something very unexpected as well, so it just shows you how life can take turns you don't anticipate. No. My next question actually kind of has a little bit to do with your family background and the influences of your family. I think a lot of young people feel kind of a sense of discomfort about war. For some, it's thankfully a completely unfamiliar experience, and for some, it presents a lot of disconcerting moral and ethical dilemmas. And I'm wondering, drawing on your own experiences as a young person growing up in your family, committed to social justice, I believe you even protested against the Vietnam War, what would you say to young people today who are grappling with those difficult feelings about armed conflict? How can we reconcile our ethical and moral discomfort with the unfortunate reality of war?
But first of all, I don't think it's only young people that feel discomfort with wars. Actually, I think just a woman that spoke here just a moment ago, I think she feels even more discomfort than any of us are able to feel, because she has really experienced war. And there are a lot of elderly people in Europe still who have actually lived through the Second World War. So I think this has nothing to do with young or old. I think a very normal human reaction is that you don't like wars, because wars is about use of force. It's about casualties, people being killed. So therefore, you have to remember that the main purpose of NATO is to prevent war. NATO was established after the Second World War to prevent anything like that to happen again. But as the old Romans used to say, if you want peace, you need to prepare for war. Meaning that NATO's main purpose is to deter any potential adversary. And as long as we do that, no NATO ally will be attacked, and we preserve peace, as we have done for NATO allies for for close to 75 years. So the fact that we see the need for strong NATO, for strong collective defense, for military forces, does not mean that we like wars. It means actually the opposite, that we dislike wars so much that we feel that we need to invest to prevent wars from happening and at least prevent any military attack on our countries. Then, also you came back to my family. Also, I'm born in 1959, so meaning I'm born after the Second World War. But I had a mother and a father, and I had the grandparents who all lived through the Second World War, and they told me and they told the children so much about both the daily life, the ration cards, and how they had dark curtains to prevent air strikes, and the kind of very daily life in Oslo during the war. So sometimes I feel, and when we walked around in Oslo, my parents and grandparents, they pointed at different places where there were sabotage and also the resistance movement attacked and so on. So So sometimes I actually felt I grew up during the Second World War, not because I really did it, but because it was so close to me, because I had family members who told me so much about it. And then the father of my mother, he actually helped Jews to leave, or to flee Norway over to Sweden. And I met one of those Jewish families, and of course that's quite moving to meet. I met he was 3 years old, a Jewish boy that was helped by my grandfather to go to Sweden. And the father of my father, he was a officer in 1940, so he fought then back in April and May and June of 1940, and then he was in a prison camp, and he also told a lot. So in that sense, wars have been part of my childhood, even though I never, of course, experienced war.
Thank you very much for that. Let's go to the audience for a few questions. I think we've got one. Wow, yeah, we have a lot of questions. We've got one right here in the middle. If you just don't mind going to the microphone so we can hear you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Secretary General. My question is, why is NATO important for younger people?
Well, as a NATO is important for young people, middle-aged people, old people, children, everyone. Because the whole idea that is only important for one group of people is fundamentally wrong. Because, again, NATO has one big important task, and that is peace. And if we don't have peace, we will not succeed with anything else. Be it to create prosperity, jobs, education, or to address big issues like climate change. But of course, you can say that peace is even more important for young people than elderly people, because they have a longer life ahead of them. So if we destroy this earth and we create war and destruction, of course, it has impact for more years for young people than for elderly people. But my main message is that what NATO does matters for everyone, and it's so fundamental. So it is important for so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the question. Okay, another question. Let's go down here on the end. Yes, if you don't mind going to the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dmytro Filonenko. I'm president of Yas Atlantic Treaty Association Ukraine, based in Kyiv. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to what NATO did and continued doing in terms of supporting Ukraine to fight against Russian unprovoked and unjustified aggression. My question is, what would be the NATO's response to a potential scenario when China launched its invasion on Taiwan and Russia is supported by Chinese military equipment? Thank you.
Well, so first of all, I think the message is that China should not use force to change status quo for Taiwan. The NATO allies, there are no changes in NATO allies on our policy on one China, and there is no justification for the threats and the coercive or assertive behavior that we have seen China being responsible for around Taiwan for actually several months and actually the last years. So that's the main message. The other message is that any changes, any disputes should be solved by diplomatic, not by military means. Then I think what we see is that China is not only threatening Taiwan, but China is also responsible for coercive actions against neighbors. They try to control the South China Sea. They have taken control over big parts of the South China, at least try to take control of big parts of the South China Sea. And we also see how China and Russia are coming closer and closer. They recently had a big naval exercise together. We see more Chinese and Russian, both air and naval patrols. So of course, this is something that matters for our security, and that's also the reason why NATO, in the new strategic concept, we agreed at the Madrid summit, actually addressed that that the military, the economic, the political strength, increasing power of China poses a challenge to our security, to our values.
Thank you, and thank you also for that question. Let's take another question from this audience, right here in the second row in the white top. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Secretary General, as we witness the increasingly severe consequences of climate change, they don't only pose a significant threat to our environments and ecosystems, but also have far-reaching implications for our security and technological development. And considering the scarcity of water and critical minerals, which are essential components for the development of cutting-edge technologies, my question is, how does NATO intend to address these issues with member states, international organizations, in order to secure these resources, minimize potential conflicts, and promote sustainability through new technologies?
One of the areas where we have really seen a change in NATO the last few years is actually on climate change. Again, the strategic concept we adopted in Madrid addresses climate change as a challenge and a threat to our security. In the previous strategic concept, we hardly mentioned climate change at all. But this language in the strategic concept reflects the reality, and that is that climate change is a crisis multiplier. It fuels conflicts, and it increases competition over scarce resources like water, land, and also, of course, leads to much more migration. So climate change matters for our security in many different ways, and therefore it matters for NATO, because NATO is about security. Second, we also understand or see that there is a very close link between energy and climate change, and we see how energy has been used as a tool, as a weapon. We saw that we have seen it now recently with the war in Ukraine, where Russia tried to use gas as a weapon to convince or to prevent NATO allies from providing support to Ukraine. And then, of course, we see this energy transition where we move from fossil fuel to renewables to cleaner and climate-friendly energy sources. And that's something which has to happen, extremely important, and very supported by NATO and NATO allies. But the challenge is that this transition, there is a risk that we create new dependencies, because the solar panels are very much dependent on rare earth minerals coming mainly from China. Windmills and also batteries are dependent on supply chains which are extremely dependent on commodities and products coming from China. So we just have to make sure that we don't make the same mistake as we made with being too dependent on Russian gas, that we are over-dependent on China. Of course, we should trade with China, but we should not be dependent to a degree that makes us vulnerable. So this energy transition, we need to make sure that we actually are able to do that in a way. We also use our own natural resources where we are developing new technologies, so we are not creating new dependencies. And the last thing is, of course, that the way we conduct military operations are directly impacted by climate change. Just the fact that the sea level is rising has a direct impact on many naval bases. The fact that we have more extreme weather, wilder and wetter and windier weather, matters for the way we conduct operations. In Iraq, we have soldiers who are training the Iraqi forces, and of course we have seen more than 55 degrees Celsius. So uniforms, equipment has to change to be able to cope with much more extreme weather. And then NATO also have to take a part in the efforts to reduce emissions. And if you look at armored vehicles and battle tanks and fighter jets and the big aircraft carrier, they're not normally very environmentally friendly. That's not the way. That's not what characterizes them the most. But at the same time, we have to understand that now there's an energy revolution taking place in the civilian sector, and not in a very distant future, the most powerful, the most effective engines will be non-fossil. So if NATO and our armed forces ends up as the last fossil sector in our societies, it will be bad for the environment, but it will also be bad for our armed forces. Because they need to be part of that transition to ensure that we have the best capabilities, the best engines, the best planes, the best vehicles. So of course, we cannot choose green defense technology if it's not effective, but I'm absolutely certain that in the future, the most effective capabilities will also be the environmentally friendly, and we need to be part of that transition, and that's exactly why NATO allies are investing, and NATO is promoting investment in green technology to ensure that we are part, also the armed forces as part of this energy revolution, energy transition.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a lot of questions. Let's go all the way to the back there. Please come to the microphone.
Hi everyone, my name is Slobodan Blagovčanin and I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's a huge honor to be in the same room with you, Mr. Secretary. My question is what we as a young Bosnians and Herzegovinians, what we can expect in the future. Is our country safe, since that I would say that with NATO we have strong partnership, and also I know that it depends on our politicians, but how is the situation right now when it comes to Euro-Atlantic integration of my country? Thank you.
First, I have to tell you that when I was a child, I lived in Yugoslavia, because that was before, you know, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, and all the other republics became independent countries. And my father worked at the Norwegian embassy in Belgrade, and we traveled a lot around in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I remember we were in Banja Luka, and many times because that was actually on the way when we went down to the coast from Belgrade, but also in Sarajevo, I had my, at least the first ice cream I remember, sladoled, was something I had in Sarajevo in 1963 or something like that. So we have very good, at least at that time, the very good ice cream in Sarajevo. That's what I remember. Then, of course, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a partner of NATO. We have worked with Bosnia and Herzegovina for many years. As you all know, NATO played a key role. We helped to end a brutal war in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 1990s. Since then, we have been there. We have a headquarters in Sarajevo, and we work closely with the authorities. Of course, you know. There are challenges, there are divisions inside Bosnia and Herzegovina, but NATO will be there to help and to reform your defense and security institutions and help you to move further towards further Euro-Atlantic integration. And it's great to have you here, because the fact that you are here also demonstrates that Bosnia and Herzegovina is a close and highly valued partner.
Brilliant, thank you. I know we have so many more questions in the room, and we actually have loads of questions coming in online, but we also have a live audience waiting for us in DC. So over to you, Colleen. Do you have some questions for the Secretary General?
Yes, thank you, Kira. Thank you so much, Secretary General Stoltenberg. So do we have any questions in the room? Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, for being with us. My name is Aubrey. I founded Globally, a nonprofit that invests in rising leaders in foreign policy. And my question is, how is NATO actively contributing to peace and security in conflict-affected countries that are outside its immediate boundaries? And what role can young people play in contributing to those efforts?
So just to be sure I understood the question is about what NATO does for countries after conflict has ended?
No, who are experiencing conflict outside of the immediate borders.
Well, outside NATO borders. Well, we have partners in many places in the world, and of course some of these partners, they are in conflict, and therefore we have helped them. I think perhaps one very relevant example is Iraq, where NATO has helped over the last years to train the forces which are fighting terrorists, and in particular fighting ISIS. So, of course, different countries receive different types of support from different institutions, it be the UN or individual NATO allies, But what NATO does on behalf of all allies is very often to help to build capacity, to train local forces, and to create stability in our neighborhood. Because when our neighbors are more stable, we are more secure. So we work with also some other countries in Northern Africa, Tunisia, or in the Sahel region, Mauritania, with helping them to stabilize their own countries and to fight terrorism and to modernize and reform their defense and security institutions, because that's important for their countries, but it's also important for us, because if they fail, the whole world and our neighborhood becomes more dangerous.
Thank you for that, and thanks for that question from DC. Do you have another question from DC for us, Colleen?
I'm sure we do. One more. Thanks.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. My name is Del Hardy. I'm a program assistant at the Atlantic Council. My question takes us back to the issue of climate change. I'm interested in hearing how you plan to maintain unity among the various NATO allied countries in addressing this issue.
Well, so first of all, I welcome the fact that we have unity, because it was a bit controversial in the beginning when we started to raise climate change issues at NATO. But as we always see in NATO, is that we have a process, we have discussions, we have different views, and then we develop common ground and we reach consensus, as we did at the summit last year. We agreed an action plan, we agreed language and ambitions for NATO when it comes to climate change, both how to reduce, the aim of reducing emissions from NATO activities, but also that we should do more on helping to develop greener and cleaner technology also for our armed forces. And I believe that one of the reasons why we are able to sustain unity in NATO on climate change is that, first of all, NATO allies are concerned about climate change, and NATO allies have signed the Paris Accord and other climate change conventions or agreements. But second, regardless of whether you're concerned about climate change or not, you have to be concerned about the fact that if we're not able to ensure that there's an energy revolution taking place also within the armed forces, we will not have the best and the most modern armed forces in the world. Because if you look a couple of decades ahead, there's no way the best engines will be fossil fuel. Because if you look at the civilian sector, there's really a revolution taking place now, with more and more car makers going away from fossil fuel cars to electric cars. So if this only happens in the civilian sector, we will end up with bad equipment, bad technology, and outdated military equipment. So I care about climate change, but even if you don't care about climate change, you should care about the fact that we have to be part of this big technological revolution. Many years ago, I read a book called The Price by Dan Jurgen, and that's about the energy revolution and oil replacing coal in the last, or at least to some extent replacing coal in the last century. And there is a chapter, at least there are some pages in that book about Winston Churchill. He was the secretary for the Navy before the First World War. And he made a very controversial and audacious or courageous decision to decide that the British Navy should go from coal-fired engines to oil-fired or diesel-fired engines. And that was just ahead of the First World War. They didn't know, of course, that the First World War was going to happen. But of course, to move from coal, we have a lot of infrastructure, you have engines, you have coal all around in all the different ports. To go to diesel was controversial, and you were quite vulnerable in that transition period. But it did so, and when the First World War broke out, it was a big advantage for the British Navy that had already made that transition. It was a new technology, and it made the British Navy faster and more sustainable, more stronger than all those navies that still had coal as the energy source for the ships. And the same way, we have to make the same energy transition for our fossil fuel-based engines. The challenge is exactly when, and in that transition period, there are, of course, vulnerabilities. But your question was on unity, and my message is that, well, those who don't care about climate change, they care about the armed forces, and therefore we need to conduct that energy transition.
Brilliant. I think exploring that link between technology and climate change, also the role of NATO in the ecosystem of technology more broadly, is very, very interesting. It's something that's come up throughout the day. I wonder if we might have time for one more question from Washington, D.C. Colleen, do you have one more question for us?
We have quite a few questions, Kira.
We do
Yes.
too.
Here, let's go. Right there. Thank you, sir.
Am I live? Good morning, Secretary. My name is Daniel Simon. I am a rising lawyer and entrepreneur of Cuban heritage. And my question for you, as we focus on the tensions between Russia and China, there are alliances, economic alliances forming as the war has developed. We have the example of the BRICS, for example. And as recently as a few months ago, we have the Russian foreign minister of Russian affairs hinting at potential deployment of military units in Venezuela and Cuba. How does NATO perceive this geopolitical implication of Russia and China's relationship with Latin American countries, and works towards stabilizing peace on this side of the world, and particularly Latin America? Thank you.
So what we see is that China and Russia are coming closer and closer. We see that they try to increase their presence and create alliances with different countries around the world. And of course, this is something we follow very closely. And I think the main answer is that when we see that authoritarian powers are coming more close together and are joining forces more closely, then it's even more important that we ensure that all those countries that believe in democracy and freedom stand together in NATO, North America and Europe in NATO, 31, soon 32 nations. And so it makes NATO even more important. But also the fact that NATO is reaching out to countries also beyond the Euro-Atlantic or the North Atlantic area. For instance, at the NATO summit in Vilnius, I have invited the heads of state and government from Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, which are our close partners in the Pacific, because we believe that it is in a more dangerous world where security is not regional anymore, but truly global. When China and Russia are coming closer, then it's even more important that we work closely with our partners all around the world, and that's the reason why we are reaching out to them, to balance the fact that Russia and China are coming closer and working more closely with other countries in different parts of the world.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Secretary General, for joining us today and for answering all our questions here and in Washington, D.C. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Please, let's thank the Secretary General with a round of applause. Can you go this way? Wow. I mean, what a spectacular day. It has been such a privilege to be here with you all and to hear all of these incredible speakers, to hear all of your wonderful questions as well. We are about to wrap up the Brussels part of the 2023 NATO Youth Summit. But before we do, I would like to try to conduct the same poll that we did earlier in the day. For those of you who were here in the morning in Brussels, you'll remember the poll and the question. But now that we have our American audience joining us in Washington, D.C., let's see if we get any different results or if it turns out the same way. You can participate in our live poll by going to the Summit app and clicking on the poll function. For those of you watching in DC, maybe you haven't downloaded the app yet, but you can do that by going to your registration email. The poll question is the same as in the morning. Maybe you all in the room have changed your minds, I don't know. What do you see as the most pressing challenge to global security today? Please go online now and submit your responses. Let's see if we get any different answers. So, round 2 of the poll. Oh, military actions by Russia is still going strong at the moment. Now that we have our audience joining us from North America, China's rise, I believe that was also in second place this morning as well. Weaponization of emerging and disruptive technologies is creeping up, though, in this poll. Let's give it another few seconds to see what comes in. Military actions by Russia is still definitely taking the lead, so it looks like you all have kind of stayed strong for on that particular issue. That was a top issue in the morning session. So if for those of you who are joining online now, or for those of you who are in DC, sounds like you actually have placed the same item, military actions by Russia, at the top of the list. That was the top of the list this morning as well, so thank you all for participating in that. All right, now, although our day is coming to a close, things are clearly wrapping up here in Brussels. They're just getting started over in Washington, D.C., so I will hand over to Colleen in just a moment. All that remains, really, is for me to thank you for being here, both in person here with me and also online. And I'd like to just remind you all that this event is very proudly co-hosted by NATO and William & Mary. And we'd also like to give thanks to our institutional partners for the event. You can see them, I think, on the screen right now. The Center for European Policy Analysis, the Center for European Policy Studies, Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, Friends of Europe, Globally, the National Press Club, National Security Innovation Network, the American Academy of Diplomacy. For those of you here in Brussels, as you can probably already hear, we have a reception in the networking space in just a moment, so please make your way over to the networking space, and it will start over there. Thank you very much to you all for spending your day with me and with all the speakers today, and over to you, Washington, D.C.